Um, Now let me introduce our speaker. Conservation has a habit of hiding its conservators behind the objects they work on. And Michael Duffy is known as the man between Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Argent. But even though he has been at the Museum of Modern Art for more years than either he or I own up to being alive, does not date himself to 1907, but much younger than I. Nevertheless, he does get to work on paintings, and I would give my eye teeth for his job. Some of you will remember Michael from the Artist Varnish conference that Icon Paintings Group held some years ago, when he and his colleague, Annie Avrim, gave an inspiring talk on Henri Matisse's The Red Studio, centering on Matisse's use of the selective varnishing to enhance colors. This is a theme, Michael tells me, that MoMA will be revisiting in the next 2 years. So that sounds like a show not to be missed. However, when we first discussed giving us this talk, I decided against asking him to speak on Les Demoiselles in favor of an even more surreal artist and painting, in keeping with the surreal times that we are living in. Michael, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Claire, and thanks for the invitation to speak to the Icon Paintings Group today. Magritte certainly is certainly a fitting subject for these surreal times. I'll begin to share my screen. And just to confirm, you can see the title page here, and I'm speaking loudly enough so that you can hear me. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Claire. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Manhattan, which is part of the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me today in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. The subject today is the rediscovery and reconstruction of a 1927 painting by Magritte, a project that spanned 5 years from 2012 to 2017. The painting pictured here is from MoMA's collection. It's the portrait from 1935, the painting that kicked off our investigations. Our investigation started in 2012 in preparation for this exhibition curated by Anne Umland and assisted by Danielle Johnson with colleagues at the Menil Collection and the Art Institute of Chicago. This exhibit highlighted the most innovative period in Magritte's artistic progress, 13 years that spanned his early career, 1926 through 1938. Between these years, Magritte develops his iconography and he's recognized as a surrealist artist. And of course, the iconic style that everyone recognizes as Magritte. The end date, 1938, marks the year that Magritte summarizes his work to date in a lecture called La Ligne de Vie and the beginning of World War II. We collaborated with our colleagues at these institutions, giving us the opportunity to study about 20 paintings in depth. And preparations for this exhibit began in 2012, and we were able to work together, as I said, with the AIC and the Menil, as well as looking into our questions. Here you see Magritte working on The Empty Mask from 1928. Magritte's studio practice, we could infer something about Magritte's studio practice by looking at archival images, such as this one on the left. I love this painting because it's like a catalog of Magritte's motifs. You can see the painting in Cardiff at the National Museum in Wales. This image gives us a clue to his meticulous and methodical studio practice. You can see that he mapped out the design of the interior frame with ruled pencil lines. And by contrast, you can see he loosely sketched in the trees in the section of the forest. The background is already finished, but and each section is painted in separately. Finally, the gold frame sections were painted on top. So these 5 paintings from MoMA's collection were studied in depth. They were all part of the exhibition, starting with the menaced assassin, the lovers, the Palace of Curtains 3, the false mirror, and the subject of today's lecture, the portrait from 1935. This portrait was painted in Brussels, and it's measured 73 by 50, which is an important note. And it's standard Marine 20 format, which is a format Magritte would use quite regularly during this time. Some of the imaging and analytical methods are listed here. We tried to apply these across the board to all the paintings we were studying to get the kind of uniform results we'd hoped for. X-ray imaging, of course, and macro XRF scanning, seen here, the setup at MoMA with the portrait on the easel. We also did pigment analysis, canvas weave mapping, infrared and UV imaging, and hyperspectral imaging. And you can imagine that all this was done with the assistance and support of our conservation scientists and colleagues in all these institutions. One really cool method of examination, infrared light. You can see here the menaced assassin in transmitted infrared light. And this shows some details that weren't apparent just with visual examination. And I think you can see he made some adjustments to the gramophone here in the contours, and also in the contours of the figure and in the faces. This valise on the floor, unfortunately, we didn't find anything inside, but further investigations may show that. Here's a detail of the same area. You can see more details in the face in infrared. And also, to give you an idea of how he worked, you can see he adjusted the length of the tablecloth, and also the table leg is overpainted the tip of the foot of the figure. Another very useful examination technique was ultraviolet. And here you can see the characteristic fluorescence orange of the cadmium pigments used in the gramophone. Also interesting to see under ultraviolet light was the kind of very delicate applications of natural resin varnish selectively, in this case, to the faces of the 3 men in the center of the composition, but also visible in the costume details of the men at the side. So Magritte was highlighting certain areas of the painting using natural resin. Also, another very important contribution to the study was the Weave Map project, which is thanks to Don Johnson and his colleagues at Rice. This gives you an idea of some of the images that were generated from X-ray images, studying and using computer-generated images to show the warp and weave thread matches. So I'll be getting into more detail on that later. And one of the more useful techniques, as I mentioned, was this macro XRF scanner. And this came to us on loan from the University of Delft. And you see here Birgit van Driel, who came to help us set up and scan the paintings. So this was a time, labor intensive kind of analysis. The portrait the size of the portrait alone took 24 hours to scan and generate maps of the pigment and elemental analysis. So the portrait, we started off by unframing the portrait and looking at it in detail just under normal light and magnification. The first thing we noticed in this detail on the left, you can see the edges are painted. This was unusual because knowing Magritte to be a meticulous and methodical painter, we'd only seen, the white priming layers around the perimeters. We'd never noticed on any of our paintings that the paint on the front actually wrapped around the edges. So that gave us pause. Also, under magnification, in particular in the glass, you could see areas of underlying paint peeping through. So this was also another interesting clue that something might be going on here. When we looked at the painting under ultraviolet light, we noticed that there were shapes in the background that didn't relate to the very evenly applied two-tone colors of the surface. So again, this was something we noticed, but we didn't actually recognize the importance of it until later. It wasn't until we x-rayed the painting that we had our eureka moment. And here's the x-ray. Forgive all the metal in this stretcher, but that's what you see there. When we enhanced the x-ray, we saw a shape that was definitely not part of what we could see on the surface. And then, of course, we had a eureka moment when we turned it on its side, and you could see very clearly this partial female figure emerging. And I think you can see pretty clearly the profile of a female figure, her torso, and that's her arm, and then also her shoulder here. So of course, this is a very exciting moment to discover this underlying composition. And of course, our next question was, what is this exactly? With that in mind, we were consulted our curatorial team, and also Brad Epley at the Menil collection, who suggested a kind of affinity with this painting. This painting is the Enchanted Pose from 1927. It's illustrated in the Magritte Catalogue Raisonné number 163, but it's listed as whereabouts unknown. So this was very tantalizing to see the resemblance, but we wanted to go further to see if it was actually something that corresponded in detail. So here I can show you an X-ray, a quadrant, the upper left quadrant of the Enchanted Pose, and then the X-ray image overlaid with this drawing, so you can see the configuration of the outline of the figure matches very closely to the illustration in the Catalogue Raisonné. So it looked like we had not actually discovered the entire Enchanted Pose, but a section of it. And just to show you, to get more enhanced imaging, we worked with John Delaney from the National Gallery of Art to look at the painting with hyperspectral imaging. And part of the treatment of the painting for the exhibition involved removing it from the stretcher. So we were actually able to mount the painting in a way that we could get a nice image of the underlying composition without the interference of the stretcher bars and the metal inside. So again, the nice thing about this image is I think you can see more clearly details in the face and the eye, and certainly in the ear, and then the whole torso here with the shoulders. And then here you can glimpse just the top edge of the columns that the figures are leaning on. We knew Magritte reworked his paintings occasionally, and there's this incredible example from the Menil collection called The Song of the Storm, which when they x-rayed, discovered this early composition of the pleasure principle underneath. So we were aware that Magritte did occasionally take canvases and rework them. But this, as far as we knew, this was just on a scale of 1-to-1, not necessarily dividing up canvases to repurpose them. So here, just to talk a little bit about the context of the paintings. So in 1927, Magritte is working in the summer on these 4 large-scale paintings shown here. And each one measures about 4 feet high by 5 feet wide. So they were some of the biggest paintings he worked on in his career. These ambitious 27 compositions explore the theme of doubling, displacement, transformation, and metamorphosis. And you can see they're placed often in a kind of stage-like setting. What do we know about the Enchanted pose besides whereabouts unknown? You can see Magritte depicts 2 full-length female classical nudes leaning against column pedestals. The figures are positioned against the sky and in a kind of floating stage. Notice how the shadows just kind of drop off into the background. And I think you can agree that this is a kind of a sky with some diffuse clouds and a kind of plain background here and a kind of plain floor. Now, why would this be lost? We know that the painting was shown at the Galerie L'Époque in Brussels in 1927, where it was praised by reviews. Surrealist writer Paul Nouget remarked upon it in a letter, so we have this documentation. Despite that, it doesn't appear in any other exhibitions after the L'Époque show. A final reference to the work is found in a letter of 1932 asking Magritte to collect a painting from the Palais des Beaux-Arts where it had been considered for display. This indicated to us that it hadn't been selected, so he ultimately retrieved the work and we don't know anything more about it. Magritte's interest in the classical nude is apparent. So here I wanted to show some comparisons with Picasso for the record. And here you see it together with the 3 women at the spring. And I think you can see some influence here with the setting and the figures of the very large, sturdy figures, kind of classical profiles that would have appealed to Magritte as well. But also in 27, he's doing these really kind of amazing paintings, you know, dealing with doubling and also with this kind of collage idea. Here you can see in an end to contemplation, you have the profiles cut away with scissors, mimicking collage techniques he used in paper and patterns and repeating shapes. And in this case, he even added little metal fasteners to the background. These little black dots are actually little metal snaps from clothing. So kind of innovative techniques that he's doing. Also the black lines in the composition, these are 3 black painted lines framing the figures, emphasize the idea of repetition, and that kind of gives a kind of cinematic type of appearance, I think. And again, Magritte's working with monumental figures in 1927-28, and in this case, superimposing figures one on the other, as in the Titanic days. And this composition is a very innovative picture of struggle and panic in a void, again, with the shadows falling away. So this gives you some idea of what Magritte was up to during these years. But it begs the question, what happened to the painting? So if Magritte divided the Enchanted pose into 4 separate canvases, where are the other 3? It was our question. Fortunately, in the exhibition was several paintings from 1935, including the red model shown here, installed with the portrait. So here's the red model. You can see it's the same size as the portrait. So this was a painting we were interested in right away. So the painting, I was able to contact the conservator at the Moderne Musée, and he confirmed that the tacking edges were indeed painted. So just to look in detail, you can see the edges here and on the bottom are kind of plain, but on the upper right, you really see glimpses of blue and kind of alternating bands of light and dark, and this kind of grayish toned flesh color, and also more kind of whitish paint. So this was super exciting to hear about and know that this could be a potential another missing piece. Well, then again, the next step was to obtain an X-ray, which we did. This is shown here. This is the X-ray of the red model, and it's not quite as spectacular an X-ray in terms of seeing figures, but I think you'll agree you can see a kind of column shape here and a sort of shadow here. And if you look closely, some feet at the bottom. And just for comparison, I'm showing you the overall X-ray image on the left and the lower left quadrant of the illustration from the catalog Rene on the right. If you turn it around, also, it becomes more apparent that this was also the lower left quadrant of the Enchanted pose. So here, lining up the tacking edges to give you an idea of what's going on. So in the background, there's a little glimpse of blue, which corresponds to this area. And then you see these alternating bands of light and dark conform to the fluting in the column. And then here you see just a little glimpse of the fingers kind of leaning on the column pedestal, and then a little bit of flesh tone as well. The Magritte then painted out this part of the tacking edge, so it's interesting, he didn't entirely want to obscure what was going on, but he partially did paint out the tacking margins in this painting. And just again, to show you a detail of the edge of the red model that's visible compared with this little cross section through the Enchanted pose. So with the blue sky, so this confirmed that this was a blue sky to us, and then the fluting in the columns, and then the fingers seen here. And then I'll just show you here what we did with some of the imaging was just to overlay the X-rays with the Enchanted pose using Photoshop, obviously, to see how the images lined up. And I think you can see clearly these the overlays of the figure and the X-ray correspond quite nicely. There's, of course, a missing section where the canvas is folded over onto the back. And then on the sides, you can see we've inserted this from the red model, since you do see these details here. So at this point, we're very pleased that we had been able to reconstruct half the painting. Our next question was, well, did he cut it into fours, or did he cut it in half and then leave another half? So we were curious to see what we could find out with the other sections. But before doing that, we consulted with Don Johnson at Rice, and he, using the software, automated software technique, to do weave maps came up with this match. So you have the 1927 painting that we were able to obtain an X-ray of. Unfortunately, the X-ray had some blank spots, so that's what you see here. But then when we compared the X-rays with the red model and the portrait, he was able to have a warp match showing this kind of design in the warp and weave that was showed that the paintings were conformed very nicely to fabric that had been taken from the same bolt of fabric. And then, so we were able to match the 27 canvases with an actual X-ray of a 27 painting that had not been overpainted. And this is in a private collection in New York. So then, to further our investigations, we went back to the mapping, the pigment mapping. And again, this was a lengthy process. So we were able to do sections of some of the paintings, but in this case, we did the entire painting of the portrait. And we had known from other examples that this was a really innovative way to help understand palette of hidden compositions. So this is a great example that I mentioned before, the Song of the Storm, the painting here, and then the X-ray, which shows this amazing underlying composition, which is an earlier version of a 1937 painting called The Pleasure Principle. And then another painting for comparison of this amazing painting called Discovery from 27, where Magritte is using faux bois techniques kind of on top of figurative painting. So when we looked at the macro XRF maps, we discovered mercury in some passages, and these small areas showing mercury indicate red pigment, probably vermilion, and you can see that it conforms to the area of the tie, and also in this foreground area where there's this faux bois technique, which is kind of reddish. And of course, we also could see from the lead map, the use of lead white in the clouds and in the figure, and in the chromium map, the use of chrome in the blue pigment. So what did we see with the portrait? So we didn't find vermilion, but we did find in the iron scans of applications of iron in the flesh tone. So you see here, the flesh tone of the figure, the face, showing through the calcium in the bottle. So the calcium is quite transparent here. So you have rich iron-based pigments in the shadow of the bottle, in the handle of the knife, and in the shadow of the plate. And I think you can see here how that is in the painting itself. So also in the flesh tones, we can assume he mixed earth pigments to obtain the flesh color based on this analysis. And as well, you may remember I mentioned there was some flesh tone peeking through this area of the glass, and that's also showing up as iron. And then of course, obviously the text on the side of the painting, you can see very clearly. In the lead map, this is interesting to compare to the X-ray. In a way, the X-ray shows more contrast between the figure and the upper layers, because Magritte used lead white mixed in with the paint to color in the background. So that was obviously on top, but you still have glimpses into the figure underneath, which are complementary to our study. And then also one last map shows the calcium in the bottle indicates that it was painted using a bone black pigment. So these were all interesting results to include in our study of the work. And this, just to give you one more detail of the iron map that's been enhanced to really pull out the details in the face and lips So the lips are more richly colored, suggesting there's a higher higher iron component there. So presumably more red. So then with this information, we were curious to go back to that black and white illustration from the catalog Resine and think about what might happen if we were to colorize it and think about what the palette Magritte may have used. So that's what we did. And this is our initial attempt to do that. And this is, you know, back in 2013. So here we matched the color from the sky that we could see on the edges and in the column and the flesh tones, and thinking about the lips being redder. And this is inferred from the two sections that we had already investigated, but you can see this area here, we weren't sure what color Magritte may have used. In the other 1927 paintings, in 28, you can see this kind of brick red brown in some of the background color. So we just guessed that it could possibly be this. But we wondered what it would actually be if we were able to find the other half. At that point, we published our information in 2015, so hoping to get the more word out that this investigation was ongoing. And then as part of that investigation, I continued to look at paintings from the 30s, in particular, the same size and date as the portrait and red model, and that were included in this exhibition held in Brussels. So, oh, I forgot to mention, there was a big exhibition in Brussels of Magritte in the spring of 1936. So one of our theories might have been that in order to produce more paintings for this, this exhibition, and having this big unsold painting lying around in his studio, Magritte might have thought, well, I'll just turn it into 4 different paintings. So here are some of the paintings that I was able to look at together with Anne or Danielle during these years after that, during the exhibition and after, but unfortunately none of them had painted edges, so we didn't continue looking into them. But we still had several that were the same size and the same date that were out there. So working together with Magritte experts like Charlie Herscovici and our curatorial team, we attempted to track these down, but because they were listed in private collections, or sold at auction, we weren't able to do so. So imagine my excitement when I got an email message from Alicia Tavares da Silva in Norwich, who was looking at this painting, which was one of the paintings we had hoped to see, telling us that she had been examining the painting for a loan, and she had discovered that the edges were painted. So here's Alicia examining La Condition Humaine at the Norwich Castle Art and Art Museum in 2016. This was very exciting news. So we tried not to get too excited at first, because without all the information at hand, this was just an initial investigation. But I think you'll agree, when you look more closely at the edges, you can see very clearly that there's kind of a lot going on the back, more so than you typically see on an average Magritte painting. So here again is Giorgia Bottinelli and Alice looking together at the edges of the painting, and I've included some details of the back. You can see in the corner this kind of dark area that's banded looking, and then particularly on the bottom edge in the center, you can see alternating dark areas like shadow, this sort of yellowish flesh tones, modulated, a little glimpse of blue, and some other dark color appearing. And then looking further into the investigation, this kind of design was made to see that, again, like the red model, you could match up these areas of the painting with the fluting in the columns, with the flesh tone of her torso, with the shadow next to her arm, and then again with just this little glimpse of blue sky here in this section here. So this was very exciting to see, and but we'd wanted to go further and see what else could be discerned. And then of course in this raking light detail, you are also able to see shapes underneath the composition that do not relate to the painting on top. So of course the next thing to do was to obtain an X-ray. So we were able to do that, or they were able to do that. And it's shown here. This is the overall X-ray of the human condition. And you can see the valley and the cave and the fire very clearly. But then also you can see other shapes that don't relate to the upper composition, like this hand, for instance, and this curve of the leg. So just to reorient it another way, thanks to Alicia for this diagram with the outline of the figurative elements on the X-ray. So what we did also with the X-ray information, we were able to go back and plug it into the weave mapping study with Don Johnson. We were able to show a warp correspondence in this with the red model and the portrait and the earlier 27 paintings shown here. And these distinctive patterns are really indicative of paintings that have been cut from the same bolt of fabric. Again, using the same macro XRF images, the conservators and conservation scientists at the Hamilton Carr came up with these images that were published in Heritage Science. So it's interesting just to see the kinds of range of palettes. So the lead white in the lead, of the opening in the cave, and you can see zinc showing up very clearly in the fire, but particularly mercury in the fire, indicating he used vermilion. So these are all interesting comparisons to the macro XRF scans that we had obtained. And so we're very excited to have them shared with us. And again, this information is published in detail in a really great article in Heritage Science from 2017. So then, spurred on by this discovery in the UK, we thought, well, there's just one section left. Where could it be? Well, luckily at the museum in Belgium, this project had just started in 2016 called Magritte on Practice. And 42 paintings from the Magritte Museum were studied together with the University of Liège and Dr. Catherine Duffy, and along with her counterpart at the Museum of Fine Arts in Belgium. So they actually systematically looked at all these paintings, and one of them included this one, God is No Saint, from 1935 and 1936. So now, why wasn't this on our list of paintings to look at? It's because it was in a private collection. We didn't know where it was. And also the size is somewhat different than the other three. It's thinner and longer. But you can see this kind of uncanny kind of comparison between this background of the portrait and the background of God is No Saint. It's kind of a clue to me, like, look here. But in any case, we did look further. Oh, by the way, the painting was donated to the museum by this private collector, Rene Magritte, and she's shown pictured here in a portrait by Magritte from 1936. I just digress for a minute. Some of you who know me well know I'm kind of an avid birder, so I couldn't resist this temptation to identify the bird in the painting. The closest I came to was this Canada jay shown here. Not that Magritte saw a Canada jay or visited Canada, but anyway, that was my attempt at turning it into an identification challenge. And you can see great, Canada jays are pretty tame, so it wouldn't be unlikely for one to land on your shoe, if not your hand. Dr. Catherine Duffy headed the investigation and Magritte and practice, and she kindly sent me this photograph of her examining God is No Saint, and you can see in this photograph how the edges are painted very similarly to the portrait, with the background colors wrapping around the edge. For no further ado, they announced this spectacular discovery of the final section of the Enchanted pose in a press release in 2017. But I'd just share you some of the images that they've shared with me and in the publication. So again, under ultraviolet light, you can see the painting has this very pretty uniform background with some modeling, but then in the UV, you can see some outlines appearing. And I think you see a curve here pretty clearly. That's about it. But then when you look at the infrared and X-ray images, then things start to really pop out. In the infrared, you can see more amorphous shapes here, but in the X-ray, it's quite clear that there's a figurative composition underneath. And just to show you the X-ray overall with the underlying figure shown here. As part of their investigation, they did a number of analytical techniques. They did, besides XRF scanning, they did hyperspectral imaging, a macro and X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy shown here, and examination under the high magnification, of course, X-ray, as I mentioned, Raman, and FTIR. So they did quite an extensive study. And then here you can see the painting being scanned in the museum in Belgium with the macro XRF scanner. And just to compare with some of the other macro XRF maps we've been looking at, showing you some elements. Of course, in the lead, you can see quite clearly the figure underneath, less so in the zinc, but still this is giving you an idea of the zinc-rich areas of the painting. Apparently he used iron-based pigments in the shoe, and then calcium-based pigments in the plumage of the bird. So these compare nicely to the macro XRF images that we obtained and that were obtained by the team at the Hamilton car. And again, they rounded off their investigations by publishing this article in Heritage Science in 2018. So we went back to our color reconstruction now that we had seen evidence of the color of the right side of the painting. And this is the color reconstruction that is now the closest to what we think the original painting looked like. Again, it's a little unusual that there's probably more modulation in the foreground and the side. So this may be something we could refine further. And that would be with further color imagery studies yet to be done. And just to give you a kind of glimpse of the overlay with the 4 paintings shown overlaid on the black and white image of the Enchanted pose to show you how Magritte cut the painting up and made these 4 other paintings. And the next step will be, hasn't been done yet, but to also add the X-rays to the weave matching report and see how it corresponds to what we've seen with the other paintings in the warp diagrams very clearly. I've just put it there for a placeholder until that information comes to us. So that's nearing the end of my presentation. I'd like to let Magritte have the last word. So in 1938, he said, "I had acquired some knowledge of the technique of painting, and I made some experiments which differed deliberately from all aspects of the painting I knew about. I savored the pleasure of freedom in painting the more anti-conformist images." So I'll leave you with that. And then, of course, the acknowledgements. So many colleagues contributed to this study. My colleagues at MoMA, some still here, and some former. The late Lars Beedstrom from the Bonheur Museum, Alicia, Georgia from the UK, and of course the team in Belgium at the Menil Collection, at the Art Institute of Chicago, and several others who helped us along the way. So thank you very much for your attention.
At the moment, we have no open questions. So does anybody have a question? Yes, we have one question. What was precisely the observation on the painting or on the analysis that sparked the curiosity to dig deeper?
For the portrait, the spark was finding these shapes. Well, first of all, seeing the edges were painted, which was unusual. And then seeing in ultraviolet, while the painting was being treated, noticing these shapes that didn't correspond to the front at all. And then since we were systematically investigating our paintings for the exhibition, we ended up doing the X-ray. And then that's when we discovered this underlying composition. So I would say that portrait was the one that led the charge to see what else we could find.
Okay, we have a question here. How long did each X-ray take? So you mentioned that the first one took something like 24 hours.
For the macro XRF scanning, because it's so detailed on a micron by micron basis, it took 24 hours for the portrait, which is, you know, this easel size, small easel size, 50 by 70 centimeters. So half a meter by a meter something. So yeah, so that's the time involved for the macro XRF scans. I'm not sure, it may depend on the setup they were using at the Hamilton Car and at the Royal Museum in Belgium. It may be less time as the techniques have developed. For the traditional X-ray, you know, that was just a matter of doing exposure and developing the film. At that time, we still used film. Now we could probably get an even better X-ray since we have a digital setup.
Okay, here's a question. Whoops, hang on. I just lost it from the screen. From Anne. Do you have any idea of what sequence the 4 new paintings were painted in? First, second, third, fourth?
That's a great question. I think, you know, he was preparing for this big exhibition. So did he cut one section, painted, cut another section, painted? I think it's pretty hard to tell, like, unless there was some evidence on the back of him dating them. I don't know. The God is No Saint is dated circa 1935, 36. I don't know if that has any significance in terms of the sequence. And maybe we could say the works that were included in the 36 exhibition came first, and then he still had a couple pieces left over of the ones that weren't in that exhibition. But that's, I think the physical evidence, we wouldn't be able to determine that kind of precise chronology of remaking.
I noticed that they're subtly different sizes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
he's sort of, oh, this isn't selling, I'll chop it in four and have four,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah,
more useful canvases in store. It's,
yeah,
you know, he's got his composition, then he's got his size of canvas, I think.
yeah. And the format, I don't know if at that time, if he had a contract with the gallery, maybe the gallery stipulated, you know, we'd like this many marine size canvases that would be part of your contract. So you already have four great big ones.
Being standard sizes.
Yeah, except, you know, they aren't exactly, at least the God is No Saint isn't exactly. I don't think it's a little slimmer, but it may be that it's close enough. But, you know, that's something I don't know for sure. That's something perhaps one of my colleagues in curatorial would know.
We suddenly have a whole bevy of questions. What was the price? Just a second. Okay, so that's that one. The IRR, the infrared IRR of the Ne Pas Un Saint looks like the shoe has used to have toes. Is this an alteration in the painting?
That's so interesting. Thank you for noticing that. To be honest, I hadn't noticed that. And I think I'm looking at it on the other screen. That's something I would ask my colleagues in Belgium if they have any theories on that. Oh, that's a great observation. And it's sort of parallel with the red model, because he takes the bottom half of the painting, and that's, you know, the unclothed figure, no shoes, and he turns it around and paints these weird shoes with toes. So he's playing with us somehow, I think.
Okay, from Joyce Townsend, you mentioned chromium in the blue sky of one of the 1927 works. Could this be a blue pigment, cobalt chromium spinel, found in other modernist works, question mark? A challenging thing to identify, may need to be answered at leisure.
That we had questions about that, and I'm just looking back at the images. And so the chromium map is from the Song of the Storm, which is 1930. It's a painting on top of an earlier painting. I'm sorry, I'm just looking for the date, but it's a painting from the 30s. So yeah, that is something we'd like to investigate further as compares with the portrait. And Anna Martins can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe we see chromium in the blue in the portrait. So it may be typical for this particular painting, which is later.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand this one. From Jennifer Gonzalez Corujo, if I understood right, you took the painting out of the stretcher. Did that bring more information than using Photoshop to adjust exposure of stretcher bars and metal plates? Did you do it in other paintings?
So at some point, the painting had been wax lined at MoMA and mounted onto this massive stretcher. This was done, in the 60s. And also the format had been altered slightly. The top edge had been cropped down, so the signature was a little bit going around the edge. So we decided we wanted to correct the format by putting it on a stretcher that was more sympathetic with the painting, and that could safely be done, we determined, without taking the lining off. But we had this opportunity then, with the painting unstretched, to be able to mount it on a plexiglass and be able to use this hyperspectral imaging in transmission, so with the light shining through the canvas. So that enabled us to do that without the stretcher bar interfering. And that's when we got more details in the face and the ear. So it was useful. We did not do anything like that with any of the other paintings because it would have been too invasive to start taking things off the stretchers just to obtain those kind of images.
Okay. I think, why do you think Matisse decided to cut up his painting to create new masterpieces instead of using blank canvases with these 4 individual works? I think we've actually answered that in the talk.
I mean, I think, it's anybody's guess, but the painting was rejected by the Salon des Beaux-Arts, and then B, it's, it might have been damaged a little bit, although none of the evidence we see shows any kind of, damage or tear or degradation of the canvas on any of the 4 paintings. So that's probably, or it was kind of, compared to the other paintings at the time, it's a little bit, not so innovative, let's face it. It looks like a Picasso, like a wooden Picasso, sort of.
Okay. Are there any other lost Magritte paintings or unknown works that may have been overpainted? Will there be other investigations on works by Magritte, especially if tacky margins appear painted? Question mark.
I mean, I'm not sure the Magritte on Practice project is still ongoing. If it is, they would probably be the ones to be identifying some new examples. And then of course there's works that are in private collections that, may never be able to investigate thoroughly, but we know even from the catalog Resnais casually mentioned, oh, this painting has another painting underneath it. And that was ones we tried to investigate if there was any kind of indication like that. But surely there are others. It's just a matter of finding them.
In terms of composition, the La Condition Humaine seems to stand out from the others. Can you comment on this? It's something to do with Magritte's brain, I think.
Oh, in terms of the composition, I mean, don't tell anybody this, but it's my favorite out of the 4 for sure. And it's a composition he comes to again and again. And I don't know, I think it's a really arresting and beautiful painting. And I forgot to mention, I got to go to Norwich and see the painting together with Alicia and Georgia. And that was really exciting because it just worked out that I was able to go and see it with them. So that was wonderful. But why is it any different? I don't know. Maybe that could be a clue to the sequence of the repainting of the other one. So maybe there could be notes in his journals or associated drawings that we're not aware of that could indicate that.
Okay. Again, I think we've answered this one, but do you think there are any more lost Magrittes out there? Is the other 1927 painting shown in black and white lost?
The other 1927 painting is in a private collection in Italy, I believe. According to the Catalogue Raisonné. So its location is somewhat known. But I've never seen it, and I don't know if the curators requested it for the exhibition and were unable to get it. That's a great question, but as far as we know, it's still there, but just in a private collection.
I just think this is a long one. I noticed on the slide where you showed the MAXRF of La Condition Humaine that in the XRR square, there seemed to be more of the faux sorry for the poor spelling, effect than, sorry, it's the faux bois.
Faux bois?
Yeah, I think so. Effect
in the
that you were talking about with reference to Magritte's work in 1927. Does that make sense? Do you think that Magritte was using that effect in the Enchanted pose? And if so, where? In the background where you mentioned it might have been modulated or elsewhere? Right.
You know, I think we would have turned up that kind of pattern in the macro XRF maps of the Norwich picture or the Brussels picture, if it was that kind of faux bois, because it does show quite clearly in the Mercury map of the Song of the Storm.
Yeah.
So I think we would have detected it, and knowing what it looks like based on these other painting, I think we would have detected it. But it could be some other kind of just very smoothly modulated surface.
Okay, only three more. Are there any hints of this particular, of his very particular varnish application on the Enchanted pose? I think you haven't managed to dig deep enough.
That's true, Claire. I think if we saw it, it would be visible in these tiny glimpses on the portrait, like in the glass that reveals her torso, or in the knife, the banding around the knife. Actually, you can see into the painting there, and we didn't detect anything like that. But again, our painting has been wax lined and varnished with synthetic varnish, so that kind of interfered with some of the interpretation. It's since been de-varnished because that wasn't a varnish that Magritte put on, but we didn't notice anything like the menaced assassin. So maybe by the 1930s, he was doing less of that kind of adjusting using varnish that he did in the late 20s.
Is there any plans basically to exhibit with a mock-up, I suppose, of the...
Yeah. Anne Umland and I discussed the idea. So I won't say no, but since it would be a project that would be great to see, and it just depends on a lot of other factors. So it would be, I think, a great idea. And since all four paintings are in museums, presumably they would be interested too, perhaps in a collaborative exhibition.
Okay, there's one about the standard formats. Did Magritte cut it into standard formats to fit stretchers, or are they random sizes? So this is really about those standard continental sizes.
I mean, in at least two, in the case of the the portrait, of course, we don't have the original stretcher, so I can't really say for sure it's, you know, this exact size, but it corresponds to a standard size. The same with the red model. In Norwich, I'd have to go back and look at the exact dimensions. It's just Liège seems to be a little bit of the outlier in terms of the size, but in all cases, he cut the canvas that was already painted and stretched it, you know, because you can see part of the painting going around, at least in the Norwich painting and in the painting in Stockholm. So,
yeah, but they all conform roughly to the
yeah,
to those sort of standard sizes that artist Cullerman would sell.
yes,
You know, pre-stretched canvases
yeah.
from
Well, a stretcher, like a standard size stretcher,
yes.
but obviously not a standard size canvas mounted on the stretcher already.
Yeah.
So it's in Liège, I need to look into more, you know, how different it is, and maybe I haven't seen that painting in person, so that's something I'd like to do.
Okay, that's it. It just remains for me to give you a huge, huge thank you. And let me know about what I said about Zabars.
Okay, okay, I'll take you up on that.
Sorry, Claire, there's just a couple more questions in the group chat.
Oh, right, I haven't caught that. What can you?
So not in the Q&A bit, if you look in the chat, I think from Christina Mandy downwards, there are questions there, 2 or 3.
I can't. Can you find them?
Yeah. Do you want me to read them out?
Yes, you read them out.
Okay, so the first one here is similar to a question asked previously. Do you think there are other compositions like the Enchanted Pose hiding underneath other paintings by Magritte? Are there other works whose location are currently unknown?
I think we've already answered that, haven't we?
Yeah. And then Patricia Smith says, were any cross sections taken which indicate whether he painted directly over the original painting or whether there was some kind of isolation coating?
Oh, that's a great question. We only took cross sections from the portrait on the edge, and we didn't see an example of that into any interlayer, but you can see on the edges of the Stockholm painting very clearly that he's done a sort of intermediate kind of layer. Now, whether that goes underneath the whole composition or it's just something he was like wiping his brush on, I'm not sure. So the limited cross sections we took on the tacking margins of the portrait did not show that, but I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't necessarily true for the others, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And then I think there's another one asking about, similar again, about whether the paintings have been regrounded before repainting, and if so,
Yeah.
are the grounds similar? And then lastly, what makes the artist significant for the period or art history in general?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
For that one. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you name it, he's such an iconic surrealist artist. I think,
Yes.
you know, and he's well represented in MoMA's collection. So that made him ripe for this kind of investigation. I'm sorry, what was the other question?
I think that's pretty much it. It was just about, oh, I've lost it now. Where's it gone? No, I've totally lost it. Where's it gone?
Oh, it's all right. So right now in the galleries, we have 3 paintings on view by Magritte. We have the portrait, we have the false mirror, which you may know is the big eye that takes up the whole canvas, And we have the Menaced Assassin, so representative of his early years at work.
Okay.
I think that's it then.
Myself to New York.
Please do. Be nice to see you in person.
Okay. Again, thank you so much. And I will be
My pleasure.
okay.
Mhm.
Be in touch.
Goodbye.
Okay. Goodbye.
Okay.